Chapter 55. Above them, the sky exploded into showers of color. Tiny fragments of it burnt and fell to the ground, artificial meteorites formed from chunks of rock knocked up into the atmosphere and yet not immediately obliterated by the power of the woken dragon. From the lawn chairs of various designs that Lorelei, or possibly Skeleton Guy who wasn't friendly like Bones, had found them, 3 figures sat and stared up at the explosions, Zhao still unsure about how he felt. On the one hand, it was all beautiful. Not just in the way the changing of the seasons were, but so achingly beautiful that he wasn't sure how to describe it, like watching a nebulae unfold, just for you. And that made it worse, because the great dragon was obviously in pain, and he didn't need to feel much of that anymore to know what it felt like. He thrashed around in the skies, and sometimes stumbled as he flew, and other times still was fine and grand, but then writhed through the heavens with such anger that... well, they were basically cavern-dwelling ants to him, so Zhao had decided not to let it get him too down. Zambi had given him a look, and that was pretty much the final word on that, and hoped that maybe something'd come up that they could do. Maybe something involving that blasphemous horn. He saw Bones, seeing him. Bones rattled his skull in a withdrawn, gentle chuckle, probably not, then. Life had been pretty great besides that though. He had been amazed just how good it felt to finally leave the caverns and make things, and even if no one else ever saw them. Above, Dragunov's pillar of light torched the ground and then exploded in a shower of golden particles as gentle as the seasonal sun. Exhausted or angry, the great dragon gave a cry of challenge, and whisked himself into the distance, great wings casting air behind him as he did. Rising from the lawn chair, decorated with images of tiny, faded blue kittens, Zhao stared up into the golden halo of the sun.
Wonder if he even notices anything else, really.
Bones, who had set to work folding the lawn chairs and putting them aside the moment Zhao had gotten off of his, and Zambi had attempted to launch herself off of hers, shook his head, adjusting the sack around himself with the air of someone trying to remember something, long since lost.
It's a good question, but the motives of something as distant as a great dragon are lost, even to me. I don't know if I never knew one, personally, but I do recall meeting someone who had, once. Possibly.
Zambi, who had kept rolling on the floor, because it was fun, came to a stop, then rolled a little back to listen better. Zhao felt a little nervous. He didn't always know if it was right to stir the pit of Bones' memories, even as compelling as they were.
I remember he was the only being I've ever met to have a worse memory than myself.
It wasn't really that funny, but Bones was so sincere that the two of them laughed, anyway, and Bones seemed more than happy enough with that, though still clearly sifting around for something serious.
HRMN. I do think that it's interesting he's mostly... that Dragunov has mostly let our works stand, though. I don't think the great dragon sees his actions as anything but just, at least right now. And justice can often be a good a motive as any for destruction.
It was random, really. Perhaps simply saying I want to live here, in peace was a dangerous statement, one that turned the world itself against you. But at the same time, they had done well, and Zhao couldn't help but feel maybe this time, there'd be something for people to come back to, somewhere to call home. His musings were interrupted by a clattering of metal as Zambi, who had gotten tired of rolling around on the cavernous ground, leapt to her feet and began scouring their much diminished supply of useful cool building stuff with a ferocious sense of purpose. Occasionally, she sent an object whizzing over her shoulders, and with great care Zhao began to pile them one on top of the other. There was no real reason for it, but he did feel somewhat pleased with himself when a small steel stood watch over their domain. He didn't know enough about it to know how it worked, yet, but Ruslana had insisted that they have access to a proper stove, affixed to one of the cavern walls and fed through a seemingly complex piping system. The roar of fire was the first warning that Zambi had started something cooking. The second being when she abandoned her experiment to stroll over with a broad grin and stood on the edge of her feet, placing her arms around his and Bones' shoulders. Her sly smile and uneven kilter made it clear that this was a major idea, and not just a passing fancy.
You got a clue what I'm thinking?
Bones narrowly avoided knocking over the steel as he peered into it. Her operation, 2 small saucepans from different eras and made of different materials, one off a burner and the other boiling merrily.
HMRN, soup stock, perhaps.
The old skeleton humored kindly, perhaps having already figured it out. Chow, however, had no clue, mostly having been content to eat fungus and the occasional snack brought over from their friends at district. Zambi smartly braced her arms behind her back and stood at attention, laughing all the while.
Nope. This is way better, and here's a hint. I was having some real hankerings for something sweet, and I thought, what'd be a sweet way to do something sweet, and I sort of combined the two. Come on, Zhao. You've got me, right?
Somehow, he felt like he was letting her down, and Chow's mind raced, but couldn't quite cross the finish line of thought before Zambi's patience ran out, and, dashing in place, she excitedly announced her master plan.
It's fudge. With fungus. Fungus fudge.
That actually explained the chunks of shining blue biomatter in the boiling pot, and it didn't sound too off. Zhao knew he always felt a little calmer after eating some of the mysterious refreshments she grew, and he remembered somebody saying that you could boil most fungus until it became sweet, but something about the idea sounded warning bells all the same.
Sounds neat. Anything I can do to help? Besides try some.
Not too long after, he and Bones found themselves deputized in the very harsh new order of Zambi's kitchen apparatus, though it actually wasn't that harsh, and she seemingly had a pretty good recipe
passed down by one cool plant lady to another plant lady from, like, forever.
Which sounded reliable to him. Bones, who had found a proper chef's hat in the clutter, was stirring the now jellied fungus, which had become a beautiful, translucent and sugary blue paste, with a little sigh.
I don't really mind missing food, you know. Cooking it is just as fun. But, you know, I do get nostalgic from time to time. Oh ho ho. Though I suppose part of that is just being old, and wondering what happens to the time you've lost. Do you ever really lose time, though? I was kind of thinking. Maybe it sort of wins around. I think what's been bothering me recently is that it's kind of cyclical. You always walk parallel roads to the people you care for, but you still walk the same pathways. If that makes sense.
Bones chuckled amusedly, tapping a very ancient ladle against the boiling saucepan. It collapsed into a heap of rusted particles, thankfully onto the ground and not in the mixture, but even still.
Ah, how embarrassing. Well, I can't say it makes sense, but not everything needs to. And you might be onto something. Maybe I just am desperate to know if this is quite so energetic tasting as it looks. Oh. Zambi. Do you think we could add some of the winter squash to it, perhaps?
Zambi, who had taken the lion's share of running around and staring intensely at the water while it boiled, paused in her tracks and gave a mighty HRRRMN, not entirely certain how she felt about adding squash to her very ancient family recipe. Her head bounced from right to left in a blur of red and green. Before she grinned from ear to ear and gave the skeleton a huge thumbs up, with both hands.
Absolutely. It's not like it's really winter squash, anyway. I mean, given that we just grew it now. Do you think the island is?
Her brows crunched up, trying to recall the word that Lorelei had used earlier.
Tidally locked? Or was that the one where it stuck in place? Ugh. Sorry, not sure. I don't think I'd be a good witch or a good astronomer.
Zhao laughed quietly to himself. He had been trying to get back into the groove of one of the last collaborative pieces they had done for the moment, a listening post with benches and what was eventually going to be a fountain, if Ruslana ever followed through with her plans for island-wide aqueducts, possibly using the old tunnels below. But even if he had been paying full attention while Lorelei and Zams were playing their customary round of game, which he had trained himself to emphasize the same way she did, with unending force and enthusiasm. Even if he had, Lorelei had talked circles around them. Even Bones, who could usually jolt his memory into something relevant about most anything if you were a good listener and patient, sometimes was at a loss for words. To be fair, though, Lorelei seemed to be as well, sometimes, simply talking to have both an audience, and one that wouldn't mind her throwing out theories, or occasionally poking holes in them.
I mean, a lot of the stuff she was talking about, we learned about growing up, but, even for our parents' generation, I guess, it must be been speculation. I'm not sure how much time has actually passed here, but I suppose I'm an adult, now? Most of the adults back home had lived in pretty cramped quarters, so.
Zhao messed with his shaggy hair, wondering if he should cut it. Or possibly risk Zemby cutting it and see what happened, but that could be a bit too risky.
Maybe they were winging it, too. We lost a lot of knowledge, but I'm pretty certain years are still years wherever you go, right? Actually, that's not true. Usually we consider a year how long it takes a planet to orbit a star. Oh no.
Lorelei appeared with only the faint and electrical thrum of magic to announce her presence, and because she appeared slightly above the ground, and then fell to the floor with a mild, buoyed, but still jarring clash of metal and rubber. Zemby, who had leapt into the air, sort of managed to wiggle through it and into Zhao, who had planned to catch her anyway, but not quite like this. He fell back into Bones, who clattered in every direction and only managed to stay in one piece through sheer dint of long-suffering will. But their experiment hadn't been knocked over, and Zemby had managed to put a lid on over the rightmost pan before Lorelei could see what they were working on, so. Victory?
I'm so sorry, I just came over to visit for a bit.
Lorelei had whipped her hat off and was fiddling with it, wheeling back and forth, biting her lip and looking fairly miserable despite the fact that the three of them were laughing. It had been harmless of course, but then again, she certainly hadn't planned quite so dramatic an entrance, and witchcraft was unpredictable. The miniature planetarium mobile of ornaments, chimes and pretty glass stars and the like, she had sewn into her hat made a pleasant cacophony of sounds as she placed it back against her head.
Don't worry about it, we're always glad to get visitors and this is how we usually roll. How can we help you, Ms. Witch?
Lorelei smiled a bit at that as Zhao held out his hand, though it vanished just as quickly as the atmosphere entirely changed. He must not have been watching where he was going as they fell, because the burn marks were still fresh, and unlike those he had become used to, they were visible welts, risen and bright like they should have stun. They should have stun, or ached, or at least felt present in some way, but...
Guess I got a little careless while cooking, aha.
Was this going to happen, forever? Was it just something he'd have to learn to live with, to be cautious?
I'll bandage it. I'm sorry, perhaps, I mean it might be something I did.
And perhaps it was, sure. He couldn't be certain, but the alternative was probably, he probably wouldn't have woken up from that dream in the first place. Zhao shook his head, frowning.
Trust me, don't go there, it's fine. I'm sure that we'll figure something out, and I'll just be careful in the meantime, right?
At that moment, he wished there was some way he could have communicated his gratitude subverbally. Somehow, Bones and Zemby knew what he was thinking, that he didn't want to worry Lorelei, maybe because she was their guest and maybe because she always looked so happy just to visit, but for whatever reason at all, they managed to project auras of confidence that helped the atmosphere calm, somewhat.
Hold that thought. How about you two finish stirrin' and Lorelei and I'll go stir up trouble.
Somewhat, at least. Zemby winked confidently at him, and though Zhao wasn't entirely sure why she was winking, he felt confident in her. Despite the fact that she was slightly slower on the ground than Zemby, who always moved at a brisk, if somewhat erratic, pace, Lorelei kept up readily enough. Outside the cavernous village, the full and languid glow of the sun baked down upon newly laid roads that stretched far into the distance, the asphalt reflecting light towards the sun in a friendly manner. Or, perhaps, in a challenge. Zemby flopped down against the asphalt, seemingly immune to the steam rising off of it. Despite her floral nature, she seemed nonplussed by quite a lot, or perhaps she was just very good at not showing it when she was.
So, did y'all learn anything?
Stalk-like feet kicked skywards, waiting for a response from the witch, but they both already knew it wasn't coming. Lorelei sighed and stared down at her own feet, and thought about willing them to kick, and thought about gnashing her teeth, but held back.
Not really, no. There's a lot that we've been talking about, but even though I've been going to this, it's really huge, even compared to some of the older places around the island I've seen. Absolutely enormous library, I don't know what to do. I don't think my magic is good for much more than restarting things, not fixing problems. Don't lose hope. Zhao wasn't kidding, you know. We're really tough, here. And he's really tough, too. And I don't think he'd like thinking you were worried about him. Bones and I'll just, keep him locked down.
That made Lorelei a little more glum, even though Zambi had meant it as a joke. Unable to stand the rising heat any longer, the plant girl leapt to her feet and folded her arms behind her back.
It's not exactly serious, and kind of a change in the topic. I don't mind. I just wish I could do more. Well, brothers and I were all thinking of visiting, and though I was gonna say we had put out these nifty new roads to a foot test, maybe you would be willing to hurdle us there.
A tinge of excited amusement pulled at the corner of Lorelei's face, and finally, unable to contain itself, turned into a full smile.
You know, I wouldn't mind trying, even if I have to do it one at a time. I know Ruslana wouldn't mind seeing you again, she doesn't mean to be so harsh, and her reaction to your prank with the high score chart on that arcade cabinet.
Zambi snickered, dabbing at her eyes in pleasant recollection.
She noticed, yes. Not that I'd do anything like that. Well, then, it's decided. We'll be counting on you, so, if you could just come back inside in less than a minute but no more than 5 minutes, I just need to go finish some stuff up.
Still talking hurriedly even as she ran back as fast her legs could carry her, Zambi slid on a patch of lichen and only just managed to land on her hands as she fell. And for a minute she wished she was as half that agility were useful for other folk, but there was no point in lingering, she had said as much. Zhao and Bones were sort of fighting, sort of slapping their hands against one another and trying to foist the new ladle off on the other. Not that she could tell why, of course, Zhao had a totally terrible sense of taste sometimes, and Bones was a skeleton, so obviously she'd have to test this one.
Is it done?
The new ladle dropped against the floor, but at least this one didn't shatter. Bones nodded, then managed a somewhat creaking bow, announcing in a deep and sonorous tone that
it is done.
And then he laughed quietly and without pause to himself, clearly quite pleased with their work.
HRMN. We added quite a bit, so I don't know how it turned out in your absence. And of course it isn't cool yet, but
a paste of colorful blue fungus, jellied and boiled until it had become thick and viscous, had been mixed with a puree of winter squash before being left to cool and harden in a square glass dish decorated with faded red images of strawberries and cats. Zambi wasn't entirely sure what the two had to do with one another.
It looks real pretty though, doesn't it?
And it did. The electric blue of the fungus occasionally emitted tiny sparks of potential deliciousness, with creamy orange spires rising up from within. It wasn't cool enough to cut and try yet, but she really wanted to.
Wow, I don't know if this is gonna be at all like what I had in mind, but I think it might even be better. Tastes like nothing.
Zhao proclaimed cheerfully, having tried some still stuck to a wooden serving spoon.
That isn't funny.
Zambi began, but for all the dumb reasons it kind of was, and because she had never been particularly good at not laughing, she was too. And he seemed pretty happy with that, and perhaps that was just fine.
I can't agree with that. I think it tastes simply wonderful.
And despite the fact that he couldn't taste anything at all, the way Bones said it made her believe it entirely. Not having tried any yet, herself, soon they had found faded papers to wrap the dish in, and Zhao had tucked it under one arm. Lorelei was awaiting their return with a slight, mysterious smile that wouldn't have been entirely out of place on Mildred, though she couldn't keep it from splitting into a broad grin as she rolled up the sleeves of her sweater.
I hope you're ready for magic, because I've got a good feeling about this.
Which was a rather ominous thing to hear, all things considered. But the moment she snapped her fingers, reality simply bent a little, and with a pleasant twang, they went from standing in a pool of fallen, multicolored leaves overfacing the noonday glow of the sun, to standing outside the increasingly reinforced walls of District, with one of Ruslana's drones. Thought, perhaps. Zhao mused, trying to recall what she called it. Staring straight at them with a camera receiver eye. It flit through the air with a hiss of hydraulics, and not too long after, the huge Cyclops who lived in the compound, Binky, approached with a huge smile.
Hello, little art friends. It is a pleasant afternoon, isn't it? It sure is.
Zhao replied with a wide grin, though it wavered a little at Binky's confusion.
Wasn't Miss Lorelei with you?
Chapter end.